Hi, I'm Josh, and you saw how long this video was, and yet you still clicked play on it. That makes me so grateful, but it's also the reason that I divide my videos into chapters, so that if you're in a section that doesn't interest you as much, you can just feel free to skip forward to the next section. So do not by any means feel compelled to watch this entire video. Those chapters are there so that you can customize your viewing to whatever suits you best. Now, as for the subject of this video, today I'm going to talk about some amazing fantasy fiction in the form of Laini Taylor's Strange the Dreamer duology that is comprised of Strange the Dreamer and Muse of Nightmares. This duology blew me away, instantly rocketed to the top of my fantasy fiction favorites, and I immediately had a dilemma of, is this going to dethrone The First Law as my favorite fantasy of all time? Mere months after The First Law took over that #1 spot? Well, stay tuned and I will get to that, but first, let me talk about these amazing books. Let's start out with a very brief plot summary. I'm only going to touch on the basics here because, as usual, I do believe that books are best enjoyed when you go into them knowing as little as possible, and I definitely don't want to spoil anything. So, Strange the Dreamer starts out, as many fantasy books do, with an orphan boy. This boy ends up working in a library. It starts off in this wonderful setting for us book lovers of this big grand library, and down in the basement of the library there are these sort of special books that nobody really pays much attention to, but our hero Laszlo is very interested in digging into these old books. He kind of uncovers some interesting things about maybe mystical, maybe real cities and lands, and in the process some foreigners come into town and Laszlo gets pulled into this great adventure where he kind of ends up in a position where there are two factions who are kind of coming into conflict with each other, and there needs to be somebody there to kind of resolve the situation. So I'm not going to talk any more about that. That's just kind of the basics of it. But as far as themes go, I will say that one of my very favorite things about this duology is that the theme of the book is peacemaking, and not, as so many fantasy books are, about war making, which really drew me to these books. Obviously, so many fantasy books are based around war, combat, violence, and yeah, I do enjoy that stuff, obviously. I put The First Law at the top of my fantasy list, but to have a book that's all around peacemaking in the midst of conflict is such a really cool thing, and I really enjoyed that theme. Another thing that I really enjoyed about these books was the writing and the prose. Laini Taylor is just such a gifted writer, and let me dive into some examples here so you can see what I'm talking about. In this scene, our characters have entered a new town and they're observing their surroundings, and this is how the town is described. If the weaver of the world itself had kept the snipped ends of every thread she'd ever used, her basket might look something like this. There were awnings over market stalls and rows of spice shaped into cones, rose and russet, scarlet and sienna. Old men blew colored smoke through long painted flutes, etching the air with soundless music. Saffron and vermilion, amaranth and coral. From each dome rose a needle-like spire, all of them snapping with swallowtail flags and interconnected by ribbons across which children ran laughing, clad in cloaks of colored feathers, mulberry and citrine, celadon and chocolate. The shadows kept pace with them down below in a way that could never happen. Enshrouded as it was in one great shadow, the imaginary citizenry wore garments of simple loveliness, the women's hair long and trailing behind them, or else held aloft by attendant songbirds that were their own sparks of color, dandelion and chestnut, tangerine and goldenrod. It's just such an enchanting description, and there's this almost poetic way in which these paired descriptor words are put together. Rose and russet, scarlet and sienna, and then saffron and vermilion, amaranth and coral, etc. Just the style of the writing is just so gorgeous. Even the similes that Laini Taylor uses are so interesting, and here are a couple of examples of those. They wielded blades called hrushtek, sharp enough to slice a man off his shadow. Sharp enough to slice a man off his shadow. Was an interesting descriptor. Here's another one. And as for fairy tales, he understood that they were reflections of the people who had spun them, and reflect with little truths, intrusions of reality into fantasy, like toast crumbs on a wizard's beard. Even the more sort of negative descriptions can be done beautifully here. Anybody who has experienced grief can really relate to how it's described here. Nova awoke to find herself left behind. The grief had been like a winter storm, the killing kind that blinds you and freezes you where you stand. Every thought was a stab, every memory a slash, until numbness finally descended. Walking through the village, besieged by stares and whispers, she'd felt dead already, and even less than a corpse. She'd felt like a carcass when the sires are done, nothing left over but bones. It sure describes much of how I've been feeling over the past couple of years, definitely. Or on the flip side of that, here's a descriptor that's going to be really appreciated by us book lovers. Also, for the 100th time that day, he remembered the kiss. It might have been brief, but so much of a kiss, a first kiss especially, is the moment before your lips touch and before your eyes close, when you're filled with the sight of each other and with the compulsion, the pull, and it's like finding a book inside another book. A small treasure of a book hidden inside a big common one, like spells printed on dragonfly wings, discovered tucked inside a cookery book, right between the recipes for cabbages and corn. That's what a kiss is like, he thought. No matter how brief, it's a tiny, magical story, and a miraculous interruption of the mundane. Which of us readers wouldn't want to find a book inside a book? And here's one example of how Laini Taylor's prose is so much more than kind of the common run-of-the-mill stuff you tend to encounter. And tell me how often you encounter the phrase when you're reading a book, they smiled, but the smile didn't reach their eyes, meaning that they had this kind of leering grin on their face, but there was malice behind it. That's such an overused phrase in my experience, but here's how Laini Taylor tackles that idea. His smiles had been pickled things, as though they'd been preserved in vinegar on some earlier occasion, to be pulled out to act as garnish to his artfully plated expressions. Isn't that so much better than the smile didn't touch his eyes? Here's one of my favorite sentences in the entire duology. And you know how when you're reading a story and the author will kind of flash back to childhood and talk about how they grew up, how they were raised, and so often that's kind of the less interesting part of the story. Well, here's how Laini Taylor tackles that. The first sentence of the second chapter in the duology comprises 3 words, and this is what it says. Laszlo grew up. And then it moves on with the story. That's the entire description of Laszlo's childhood in 3 words. And finally, one other thing that made me smile here. This passage occurs in the aftermath of some violence that has happened, and it says, there were carrion birds in the sky, circling and cawing ugly cries that Laszlo imagined translated as, die so we can eat you. Probably accurate. I'm now going to get into the section that I always kind of dive into, which is my personal area of knowledge and expertise in kind of 2 areas. One is my years of working as a paramedic has given me obviously some knowledge and insight into how injuries and death occur. And then my lifetime of studying kind of historical weapons and armor and medieval combat in particular has given me a little bit of knowledge on how medieval weaponry and fighting happened. So I've talked about most of these things in previous videos, so I'm not going to dwell on them. Let me just lightly hit a couple of these. This is yet another example where we have characters who are being held at bow point. We have archers holding their bows on characters, and it says the air pulsed with tension. You could feel the drawn bowstring, the flex of scarred knuckles, the warriors' hissed breath, and their sharp desire to let go, to let fly, to kill. And I've said it before, a war bow of any power is not one that you're going to be able to hold indefinitely against somebody. It's one where you draw, aim quickly, and release, and the amount of strength that's required to do that is pretty incredible. Similarly, up above, the archers loosed arrows. Sarai heard the twang of bowstrings from all sides. And again, obviously, authors like to talk about the twang of bowstrings, which isn't really a thing. I've given examples in a previous video. And similarly, we have a character drawing a sword, and it says, "It came free with a deadly shink." And again, this is something that comes from movie sound effects, the sound of swords coming out, the shink of a sword being drawn. In reality, scabbards are made out of wood and leather, and when you pull a sword through them, it's not this sort of metal on metal scrape that the movie sound effects seem to imply it is. Here are now a couple things related to injuries and death. In this example, a character has been shot with an arrow, and it says, "The arrow had hit high off-center, burrowing under her right shoulder blade. There was a lot of blood. It was vivid carmine. Against it, her skin looked sickly pale. She didn't think the wound was mortal, at least not if it could be tended, and if it wasn't followed by another and another." The fact that an arrow has pierced somebody's back under the right shoulder blade with a lot of blood, I mean, there's obviously a lung that is going to be hit and the lung will collapse, and given the state of medieval medicine, the fact that she says she didn't think the wound was mortal is a bit silly. However, a couple of things related to dead bodies that the author got dead on. Didn't mean to say that. But we have here somebody who's looking at a dead body. She had never touched a dead body and hoped she never would again. It was so inert, so vacant. And that's a great way to describe what a dead body looks like. I've seen dozens and dozens of them, and there is this look about a body that even somebody lying completely still can't replicate. And it is that sort of vacancy and inertness. And relating to all of that, we have this statement, which I think is true. "She reached up for her own throat and wrapped her hands around it as though she could protect it. Her pulse was frantic, her breathing ragged, and it seemed impossible that people could live at all with such flimsy stuff as skin keeping blood, breath, and spirit safe inside their bodies." Yeah, certainly in my paramedic experience, it's clear that the human body is so amazingly resilient and at the same time so incredibly fragile. It's a weird dichotomy for sure. But next up, let's just look at a few passages here that I particularly enjoyed and that made me smile a bit. The first here is a description of the library that I said our orphan boy had started out his life working in. And of course, if an author is going to describe a library, it has to be the greatest place on earth. It has to be the greatest place on earth. So here is how this library is described. And of course, us book lovers are going to just soak it right up here. "The great library was no mere place to keep books. It was a walled city for poets and astronomers and every shade of thinker in between. It encompassed not only the vast archives, but the university too, together with laboratories and glass houses, medical theaters and music rooms, and even a celestial observatory." Skipping ahead a couple sentences, "Laszlo was in a state of awe from the moment he passed through the gates. His mouth actually fell open when he saw the Pavilion of Thought. That was the grandiose name for the ballroom that now housed the library's philosophy texts. Shelves rose 40 feet under an astonishing painted ceiling, and the spines of books glowed in jewel-toned leather, their gold leaf shining in the glaive light like animal eyes. The glaives themselves were perfect polished spheres, hanging by the hundreds and emitting a purer white light than he'd ever seen from the rough ruddy stones that lit the abbey. Men in grey robes rode upon wheeled ladders, seeming to float through the air, scrolls flapping behind them like wings as they rolled from shelf to shelf. It was impossible that he should leave this place. He was like a traveler in an enchanted wood. Every step deeper bewitched him further, and deeper he did go, from room to room as though guided by instinct, down secret stairs to a sublevel where dust lay thick on books undisturbed for years. He disturbed them. It seemed to him that he awoke them, and they awoke him." From books we go to fashion. You'll see why I appreciated this description of this character. "She wore her head shaved, all but an inch-thick strip down the center of her scalp, which she left long and wove into a single braid." And here's something that any of us who's been self-conscious at any point can relate to as well. It does something to a person to be looked at like that, especially someone so accustomed to disgust. Sari had a new, disconcerting awareness of herself, as though she'd never realized how many moving parts she had, all to be coordinated with some semblance of grace. It worked itself out so long as you didn't think about it. Start worrying, though, and it all goes wrong. How has she gone her entire life without noticing the awkwardness of arms, the way they just hang there from your shoulders like links of meat in a shop window? She crossed them. Artlessly, she felt, like some arm amateur taking the easy way out. What a great description of the self-consciousness of your own self that's being observed by somebody else. And next we have an older gentleman giving love advice to a young man. The young man says, "Is that how one meets girls?" asked Laszlo, only half in jest. "Well, the river won't freeze for months. I have time to rally my courage." "Bah! Girls are not a hibernal phenomenon. Go now. Pick some flowers and find one to give them to. It's as simple as that. Look for kind eyes and wide hips. Do you hear me? Hips, boy. You haven't lived until you've laid your head on a nice, soft..." Mercifully, he was interrupted by the approach of a scholar. There you go. Kind eyes and wide hips. What more could you want? Speaking of being older, here's the same older fellow. The old man saw and let out a huff of exasperation. "Fine, fine. Enjoy your receipts. I'm not giving up on you, though. What's the point of being old if you can't beleaguer the young with your vast stores of wisdom?" And then the other character says, "Then what's the point of being young if you can't ignore all advice?" And the last one here is an interesting statement about wishes. Two characters are speaking. The first says, "And I suppose all the wishes come true," Minya said, sarcastic. "Of course not, silly girl," Suhaila retorted. She had not grown up in an era of optimism, but that didn't mean she'd lived without dreams. "Wishes don't just come true. They're only the target. You paint around what you want. You still have to hit the bullseye yourself." So you can see that these books are just chock full of these just beautiful little moments and statements that really kind of spoke to me and made me happy. Before I carry on here, allow me to take a quick second to send out a big thank you to my Patreon supporters, especially to my higher tier supporters, Joanna and Paul, and a big thank you to my even higher tier supporter, Asmondas Perfect. Thank you for your support, for your motivation to keep doing what I'm doing. It really means a lot to me. Next up, we'll talk about gods and good and evil and life after death and all that fun stuff. So I've kind of thought that if a god or gods exist, and if a god is basically a being who is effectively infinitely more powerful than us, then who's to say that a god would be a good being or a benevolent being? I think our ancient ancestors toyed with this idea more than we did, like the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, whereas nowadays people who believe in a god or gods tend to see them as being good and benevolent and so forth. However, in this duology, the gods are at best an interference with the humans and what the humans are trying to accomplish, and that's being generous. They're really quite awful beings. So here's kind of the approach to the gods in this duology. The character is speaking and says, "He also did terrible things to save the people he loved. It wasn't his fault, and it wasn't Korra's or yours. It was the gods, like a canker at the center of everything." So that's definitely an interesting approach to deities. Now, in terms of talking about good and bad, I do like what it says here. "It was his manner, the warmth of him, like steam rising from tea. One looked at him and thought, here is a great man, and also a good one, though few men are ever both." It's an interesting thought that few people are both good and great. On a similar theme, we have this. Two characters are speaking with each other. The first one says, "No." He shook his head, unwilling to believe it. "They're good people. It will be a surprise, yes, but they couldn't hate you just because of what your parents were." Sarai stopped walking. "You think good people can't hate?" she asked. "You think good people don't kill?" Her breathing hitched, and she realized she'd crushed his flower in her hand. She dropped the petals into the water. "Good people do all the things bad people do. It's just that when they do them, they call it justice." And that's a similar concept to the whole history is written by the victors. The heroes of the story are the ones who are writing it and portraying themselves as heroes. So the people who consider themselves to be good are the ones who are labeling it as justice and justifying their actions and calling them good. Next idea here. "The monks kept a sharp eye on him, determined to keep him free of sin, and of joy, which, if not explicitly a sin, at least clears a path to it. He was kept busy, If he wasn't working, he was praying. If he wasn't praying, he was working, always under adequate supervision to prevent his vanishing like a wild creature into the trees. Why does all the fun stuff get labeled as a sin by religion anyways? That's what I want to know. And this statement is true to real life, about life after death. And what then? What came next? Was there anything after death, or only nothingness forever? It was a mystery. As the saying went, the ones who know can't tell us, and the ones who tell us don't know. True enough. So this next little section is going to take a look at hate and conflict, violence and war. Like I said, one thing I really loved about the books is that it is a book about peacemaking and conflict resolution. However, that's not to say there isn't a fair share of violence and death in this book, because there is. So anyways, let's start with looking at hate. And it's a good lesson for us today as well. The function of hate, as Sarah saw it, was to stamp out compassion, to close the door in one's own self and forget it was ever there. If you had hate, then you could see suffering and cause it and feel nothing except perhaps a sordid vindication. And in this internet age, there's a lot of hate floating around. And isn't that true that hate stamps out compassion? We certainly need a lot less hate and a lot more empathy. Of course, this is all connected to the division of society and the entrenched factionalization that is unfortunately so natural in people. Here's what the books have to say on that idea. Two characters are talking again. Ruby huffed a laugh. It sounds like you're on her side. The other character says, Don't be simple, said Sparrow. It was so easy to call sides, and so unhelpful. We're all on the same side. Even her. You can be on the same side and have different ideas. And that's something that people nowadays just have no concept of, seemingly. The fact that you can be on the same side, be working towards a common goal, even if you have different ideas. So it is so unhelpful to turn the other people with different ideas into the other, the ones who need to be bashed down and so on. Here's our next idea. We have one character who is trying to approach another character who does carry a great deal of hate and violence within her. And so it says, instead of ordering, the nurse asked. She deferred to her and let her choose. And the coiled thing in Minya relaxed just a little. It was fear, of course, though Minya did not know it. She believed it was rage, only and always rage. But that was the costume it wore, because fear was weakness, and she had vowed to never again be weak. Again, just so true that what we think is rage and anger so often is fear, and we just don't want to admit that. It's why if somebody has a platform and they're willing to stir up fear in their followers, then that fear is immediately translated to anger and so often to violence in turn. And when we take a step further to war itself, we see the damage that that causes. This is talking about a nation called Zosma, and it says, that was the year Zosma sank to its knees and bled great bouts of men into a war about nothing. The war, of course, did not content itself with soldiers. Fields were burned, villages pillaged, bands of displaced peasants roamed and razed the countryside, fighting the crows for gleanings. So many died that the tumbrils used to cart thieves to the gallows were repurposed to carry orphans to the monasteries and convents. And that is definitely something we need to keep in mind, is that the great burden of war is often borne by the civilians and the people who aren't directly involved with the conflicts that are occurring. So the final big section that I'm going to cover here is another of the main themes of the book. So like I said, I really love the theme of peacemaking, but there also is a theme woven throughout these books about trauma, PTSD, intergenerational trauma, and the effects that all of these things have on an individual. And for me, this hits really close to home because I do have very severe PTSD. And so there was a lot here that I was reading that really struck a chord with me, and I want to go through some of that right now. Tell me if this isn't a great picture of PTSD. One character is talking to another about the character that has the PTSD as we know it, and the character says, "And that's her mind. She lives there. It's no wonder she can't hear me talk about mercy without wanting to gouge out my eyes. It's like it just happened, like it's still happening over and over all the time." Talking about the mind, the character is thinking, the mind is good at hiding things, but there's something it cannot do. It can't erase. And again, later in the same book, the mind is good at hiding things, but it can't erase. It can only conceal, and concealed things are not gone. And here's something that hits really close to my specific reasons for having PTSD as they relate to my paramedic career. As strong as he looked, inside he was a ruin, or perhaps a funeral pyre, like the cusp, only instead of the melted bones of E.G., he was made up of the skeletons of babies and children. This next bit, again, is so personal because it talks about how this type of trauma affects a person's ability to interact with other people and to give comfort to other people. And ultimately, when marriage broke down, in part due to this concept, and it's talking about a grieving character, and it says, she hugged her arms around herself. Laszlo thought they should have been Errol Fane's arms. Even he could see that. But Errol Fane was trapped in his own shock and grief and kept his great arms to himself. Which then relates to this. You learn what you want when you think you can't have it. And Errol Fane wanted his wife. Next up is a character who has just witnessed something horrible. "No," said Saray's soul. Sometimes that's all there is. An infinite echo of the smallest of words. No, 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 no. Forever. Now, paramedics are known for having a real black humor, and it's kind of no wonder, I suppose, but here's what the book has to say about that. "And that's how you go on. You lay laughter over the dark parts. The more dark parts, the more you have to laugh. With defiance, with abandon, with hysteria, any way you can." Let's look now at how this all relates to hatred. He had been the plaything of the goddess of despair. Isagal had mangled his emotions, poisoned his faculties for love and trust, until they were so tangled with hate and shame that he hardly knew one from the other. And that is what happens when love and trust break down, isn't it? Similarly, all the anger was sucked away in her wake, and it left a void. What else was there when you took away the anger, the hate? If there hasn't been healing, there isn't anything else. And how does hope fit into all of this, if it does fit in at all? The book says, the idea that she could stay here, be safe here with him, it was like a window swinging open, light and air rushing in. But fear, too. Fear of hope. Because the instant she understood what he was proposing, she wanted so badly for it to work. And when did she ever get what she wanted? On that exact same theme. Or maybe it was the future the mark portended. Marriage, motherhood, family, continuity. Being a person with a life and every expectation of a future. All things Sarai didn't dare to dream about. Or things she shouldn't dare to dream about. Like nightmares, dreams were insidious things and didn't like being locked away. Just on a personal level, I can definitely say that all the traumas and loss that I've experienced has made the whole concept of hope seem like such a weird and foreign idea. And all of this leads on naturally to the very darkest part of this whole thing, I think. And let's just dive straight into what the book says. He looked him right in the eyes and saw a man who was great and good and human, who had done extraordinary things and terrible things and been broken and reassembled as a shell, only then to do the bravest thing of all. He had kept on living, though there are easier paths to take. And the other book says pretty much the same thing here. But Sarai knew what she knew. What only she knew, and the greatest feat of strength she had ever witnessed was the one he performed every day, continuing to live for the sake of others, when it would be so much easier to stop. I'm not even going to get into my personal experiences on that, because that is going to get too dark for a book review. But let's end on this very, very important point. Again, two characters talking to each other. Cora was shaking her head. "It's not your fault. I should have gotten free and found you. I should have been stronger." the other character says, "It isn't weak to ask for help." And that's the very best statement I can leave this section on. So what about the rating for this duology? It should be no surprise that after finishing these two books, I rated them 10 out of 10. Absolute perfection. Or as perfect as a book can be. Obviously, there are a couple of issues that I mentioned earlier. But I'm going to come back to this theme one final time and read the very last little passage from the books here. And this here is the central premise of the book, and it says, "It's easy to make people cry. Grief, humiliation, anger, there are countless avenues to tears. It's easy to make them scream too. There are so many things to fear. But how do you stop someone from crying? How do you lead them out of fear? Can hate be reversed? Can revenge be diffused?" I love that that's what these books are about. And I will say that in terms of their classification, I'm glad going into these books that I did not know that they were classified as young adult fantasy, because I just don't read young adult books. I am not a young adult. I'm in my mid-40s, so relating to characters who are kind of entering adulthood and experiencing love for the first time and all that sort of thing, it's not necessarily stuff that connects with me at this stage in my life. And so when I was reading these books, it occurred to me that our characters here are teenagers, kind of later teens. Some of them are discovering love for the first time. They're experimenting with physical love for the first time ever. And there is a strong element of romance woven throughout the story, which, again, is something that I'm not used to in the books that I read. Yeah, there is some romance in a lot of the books, but it was a big part of this duology. And the romance, too, just added to this theme, I guess, of love over hatred. And that's so much of what sets this duology apart from other fantasy series, like I alluded to earlier. Other fantasy series that are just chock full of violence and war, and that's what the books are about. There is another series that is supposedly about two conflicting nations trying to find a common ground and peace with each other. I'll have to link that here, but that is an interesting idea that I would love to see explored more in other works. And so I went online and I looked it up and I was like, oh, these are young adult. What do you know? Glad I didn't know that, or I might not have picked up the books. But since I did, and since I read it, I had to decide, do they dethrone The First Law as my #1 books of all time as far as fantasy fiction goes? And I thought about it, and even now, as I've just finished talking about these books and reliving some of these great experiences I've had with them, I almost want to say, yes, it is my #1 book, but what I ultimately settled on is that they would be my #2 fantasy books, just below The First Law. There was just something about Abercrombie's writing style, his characters, the fascinating themes that he explored in The First Law. It's very, very close. You know, it wouldn't be hard for me to put this at #1, but ultimately I'm going to say it's just a shade under The First Law in terms of my fantasy rankings. So that's it for the Strange the Dreamer duology. As always, I want to know what you've been reading. What books have you picked up lately that you are excited to get to? Please do tell me all about it in the comments, and thank you so much for watching. Holy cow, you made it to the end of this video. That really does mean a lot to me. The other thing that means a lot to me is if you would give it a thumb up or subscribe to my channel, or maybe share this video with one person that you think would enjoy it. Cheers. One word of advice is don't be belting out punk tunes just before you're going to be recording a couple hours worth of video. Not so good for the voice. I mean, that should go without saying, but you know. And so those, because I want to spoil as I do the even the more negative descriptions can be described. The first chapter The first sentence of the second chapter in this, if she lost again, there would be no pieces to pick. If she lost, and it said it came, given the state of medieval medic, it ranged across the top of Zosimo's Ridge, which knifed, whatever. Sari had a new, artlessly she felt, like some artlessly she felt, like some amateur. And next we, and more than, and to my higher, what we think as, what? 335, S335? He was ruined, hold on. 351. It was funny.